The story begins in a quiet hour before dawn, when Washington still smelled of wet pavement and coal smoke, and the Capitol dome loomed like a pale ghost above a city not yet awake. The war in Europe was entering its final convulsions, and the Pacific still burned endlessly on the maps. But on this particular morning, April 13, 1945, the greatest shift in American wartime power did not come from a battlefield, a bomb test, or a foreign negotiation. It came from a single, shattering announcement whispered through the corridors of the White House. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. To the outside world, the shock was immediate and disorienting, like a stone hurled into still water. Radio stations cut into their broadcasts. Church bells tolled across towns that had already given too many suns to the sea and the sky. But inside the government, the tight cluster of advisors, confidants, strategists, and wartime architects who had shaped American strategy for more than a decade, the news detonated with an entirely different force. These were men who had memorized Roosevelt's habits, tempered his moods, shielded his secrets, and translated his intentions to generals whose decisions trembled across continents. They had assumed the war would end with Roosevelt still at the helm. They had assumed continuity. Instead, a man they barely knew, Harry S. Truman, a quiet Missourian who had spent most of his vice presidency in the shadows, was suddenly the center of a storm he hadn't created. On the night Roosevelt died, Truman was ushered into the White House as if stepping into a vast, dimly lit puzzle. The hallways reverberated with whispers. Staff members moved with the stiff, uncertain gait of people who had lost not only a leader, but the gravitational force of a world they understood. Roosevelt had dominated Washington the way a mountain dominates a valley, enormous, immovable, casting long shadows. Truman was smaller, humbler in bearing, almost tentative. He stood at Roosevelt's desk, as if afraid to disturb the air that still carried the late president's scenting, tobacco, and the faint musk of a man who had carried the weight of nations across his shoulders. He knew, even then, that he was stepping into a room where loyalties were older than his place in it. As he scanned Roosevelt's papers and finished drafts, clipped cables from Europe, a letter half written to Churchill, Truman felt the dread that came with inheriting a war fought in another man's voice. The global front was a labyrinth Roosevelt had navigated with instinct sharpened over 12 years. Truman, by contrast, had been excluded from almost all wartime secrets: the Manhattan Project, Yalta, covert negotiations in China, the inner calculus of military command. He had been vice president in title only, drifting on the periphery while Roosevelt's true circle managed the machinery of war. Now, those same men watched him with guarded eyes. They were brilliant, hardened, intimately connected to Roosevelt's mind, and completely unprepared for Truman. Their loyalty had been to a president who had trusted them implicitly, who thrived on fierce internal debate and tolerated forceful personalities. Men like Admiral Leahy, Harry Hopkins, Henry Morgenthau, and the powerful brain trust of policy advisors had not simply served Roosevelt. They had formed a kind of internal republic, each fighting for influence over the great wartime strategy. In Truman's first hours as president, he sensed it immediately. The room did not belong to him. Not yet. The advisors spoke in tones crafted for Roosevelt's tastes, with confidence meant for Roosevelt's ear. Their glances toward Truman carried both courtesy and condescension, like seasoned officers studying a new recruit, whose uniform was the clean dot. But beneath their polished deference ran a deeper tension, that Truman might disrupt not only strategy, but the very architecture of their influence. For days the White House felt like an uneasy coalition of two worlds: the old Roosevelt loyalists and the new president who couldn't yet command their trust. Truman moved from meeting to meeting with the practiced politeness of a man who understood that every nod, every pause, every question would be dissected later behind closed doors. Yet beneath his steady exterior lay the faint tremor of someone walking through a darkened room, searching for threats without knowing where the furniture had been left. He had inherited a global war, but also a government that did not entirely want him. The tension grew sharper in the war briefing rooms, where generals spread maps across long tables like battlefield autopsies. When Roosevelt had attended these sessions, the air crackled with his particular authorities, soft-spoken yet immense. With Truman, the atmosphere changed. Advisors spoke more slowly, as if translating complex strategies into simpler language. When they exchanged glances, it was as though Truman were not yet a participant, but an observer. He understood perfectly what this meant. They doubted him. One evening, Well past midnight, Truman lingered in the Oval Office long after the staff had gone home. Rain tapped against the windows with the steady rhythm of distant artillery. On the desk before him lay Roosevelt's final briefing folders. Truman opened them one by one, studying not just the words but the patterns of thought. How Roosevelt framed decisions, who he asked for counsel, which details he underlined or ignored. It was like trying to read the mind of a ghost, still lingering in the room. A line from one report about the Pacific caught his eye, something about operational secrecy consistent with presidential instruction. Truman stared at it for a long moment, feeling the weight of what had been withheld from him. It wasn't simply that Roosevelt had kept secrets, it was that the entire architecture of wartime decision-making had been built without him in mind. If Truman failed, the advisors would say he had never been ready. If he succeeded, they would say he had followed their guidance. He realized then that he needed to break the structure before it broke him. The turning point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, during a briefing on the final stages of the war in Europe. A senior advisor, respected, brilliant, irreplaceable, spoke over Truman as if he were chairing the meeting himself. His voice carried an easy authority, shaped by years of Roosevelt's trust. When Truman asked for clarification on troop dispositions in Bavaria, the advisor dismissed the question with a curt explanation. More correction than answer. Something in Truman hardened. He looked around the room and saw, with sudden clarity, that he would never fully command these men as long as they believed Roosevelt's shadow still ruled. They would always speak as though they were answering to the dead, not the living. They would guide him only where they wished the war to go. They would allow him ceremony, but deny him agency. And in that moment, Truman understood the cruel arithmetic of leadership. To lead the war, he must own the war, and to own the war, he must dismantle the circle that believed itself untouchable. The decision did not come from anger, it came from necessity. A president who could not direct his own advisors was not a president in wartime. He was a steward, a caretaker, a signature beneath orders drafted by others. So Truman began quietly, almost invisibly. A reassignment here, a resignation, encouraged there, a replacement hired under the pretense of fresh eyes for the post-war period. The process unfolded, like the slow turning of gears deep inside a locked machine. Advisors who had once walked through the West Wing with effortless command found their access narrowed, their responsibilities diluted, their influence dissipating like evaporating breath on cold glass. Some understood immediately, some resisted, some whispered that Truman was dismantling the very structure that had guided Roosevelt to victory. But Truman pressed on. He replaced long economic advisors with figures who aligned with his own instincts. He reassigned diplomatic strategists who continued speaking of foreign policy as if Roosevelt's voice still echoed in their ears. He reorganized military channels so that information flowed through him first, not as a courtesy, but as protocol. He corrected generals who skipped the chain of command, and in private, he confided to a single trusted friend that a president could not share power with ghosts. As weeks passed, the Roosevelt circle shrank from a ruling constellation to a fading ember. Truman's authority grew not through force, but through certainty. He spoke more firmly. He asked sharper questions. He made decisions with a deliberation that suited the gravity of a world at war. By early summer, Washington no longer murmured Roosevelt's name in every room. It murmured Truman's. And yet, beneath the surface of this transformation, the question remained unspoken but alive. Had Truman removed Roosevelt's men simply to secure power, or had he done it because the war demanded a leader who could act without hesitation, without comparison, without inherited loyalty? History would answer that question only gradually, in the slow unfolding of events, still hidden behind sealed doors. But on that quiet spring night, as Truman watched the Capitol lights glow across the Potomac like distant fires, he felt the shift deep inside himself, not triumph, not relief, but the solemn realization that leadership was not a gift bestowed by circumstance, it was a burden claimed, and he had just taken the first step toward owning it. In the weeks that followed, Truman's quiet reshaping of the government grew into a decisive conflict, one not fought with armies or fleets, but with influence, loyalty, and the heavy silence of closed-door meetings where futures were decided without a single raised voice. Washington had entered a new season, one in which familiar faces no longer carried the weight they once did, and where the corridors themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see whether the new president would falter or harden. Across the river at the Pentagon, the mood had sharpened as well. Generals accustomed to Roosevelt's sprawling, conversational style found Truman's directness unsettling. He requested summaries instead of speeches, clarity instead of ritual, and he possessed an unnerving habit of pausing just long enough for a man to reveal what he hoped to conceal. His questions cut through the haze of assumption that had clouded wartime deliberations, and the military establishment felt a subtle shift, an unfamiliar tightening of the chain of command. Yet for all his newfound confidence, Truman understood he was still navigating a world built in Roosevelt's shadow. Every room he entered still bore a faint memory of the late president, like a lingering fragrance that could not be scrubbed away. Even the maps on the wall, the vast Pacific theater stretched across one, the fractured plains of Europe across another, seemed to remember Roosevelt's fingertips tracing their borders. Truman felt those maps watching him each time he stepped into the Situation Room, as if testing whether he belonged. The real confrontation began in early July. During a briefing on the final stages of the Pacific War, the Japanese home islands were bracing for invasion, and American planners estimated that the cost lives months. Resources would be staggering. They spoke of landing zones, defensive fortifications, kamikaze reserves, and the terrible arithmetic of a war that refused to die quietly. Truman listened carefully, his face still, his posture rigid. The war was nearing its end, but its conclusion would shape the entire post-war world. And then, at a moment chosen with surgical timing, General Marshall cleared his throat and introduced a subject of staggering secrecy. There was a new weapon, a weapon Roosevelt had known, a weapon Truman had been told nothing about until now, that the Manhattan Project. The words moved through the room like an electrical surge, though most present already knew the truth. Only Truman had been in the dark. As the generals and scientists spoke slowly, heavily, as if unburdening themselves of a confession, Truman listened to descriptions of destructive power that sounded less like warfare and more like the rewriting of natural law. A bomb that could erase a city, a force drawn from the heart of the atom, a creation so immense its very existence warped the room's emotional gravity. He said little, he asked precise questions, he absorbed every detail. But when the briefing ended and the others departed, Truman remained seated, staring at the polished table where his reflection trembled faintly on the wood grain. For the first time since taking office, he felt something colder than doubt. He felt isolation. Roosevelt had died with this secret locked inside him. Truman was inheriting not only the project but the moral weight that came with it. Outside the room, he heard the low murmur of the departing advisors' voices, shaped by years of Roosevelt's trust. Voices that assumed their own authority in guiding the project forward. And Truman understood with piercing clarity that if he did not take full command now, if he allowed Roosevelt's circle to direct the weapon's future, the presidency would become a hollow vessel, carried by currents he could not control. The confrontation came the next morning. In the cabinet room, sunlight poured through the tall windows, turning the dust in the air into drifting gold. The Roosevelt loyalists sat in their accustomed places, each radiating an air of long-cultivated expertise. They expected to brief Truman, to advise him as they had advised the president before him. But Truman opened the meeting with a tone that startled even those who thought they had begun to understand him. From this moment on, he said, every decision regarding the conduct of the war will go through my office first. Anger. No flourish, just an iron clarity that left no room for interpretation. Silence folded across the room like a heavy top. One advisor, soft-spoken, impeccably intelligent, a fixture of Roosevelt's inner sanctum, leaned forward to offer a gentle correction, reminding Truman of the systems Roosevelt had established. Truman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I am not Roosevelt, he said, and this is not his White House anymore. His words drifted into the stillness like the first stones of an avalanche. What followed was not a dramatic explosion but a slow unraveling. Some advisors tried persuasion, others appealed to tradition. A few used the subtle language of bureaucratic resistance, delays, omissions, strategic but Truman had already made his decision. He was done sharing governance with a council of the past. He initiated a quiet but relentless restructuring of the administration. One by one, the pillars of the Roosevelt era were moved aside. Hopkins, weakened in health and influence, stepped down. Morgenthau, once a commanding presence, found his policies sidelined. Even Admiral Leahy, the closest link between Roosevelt's war mind and Truman's present, saw his influence measured rather than assumed. Some departures were graceful, some were resentful, Some carried a sting that Truman felt long after the signatures dried, but all shared one truth. Truman was reclaiming the presidency from the dead. The confrontation reached its quiet climax at Potsdam, where Truman met Churchill and Stalin under the brooding clouds of a Europe still smoldering. The Roosevelt advisors had expected to shepherd Truman through the subtleties of diplomacy, to form a protective ring around him as they had around Roosevelt. They had assumed the new president would lean on their experience. Instead, they watched him step forward alone. He entered the conference halls with the composure of a man who understood exactly what he must project. His handshakes were firm, his gaze leveled, his sentences deliberate. He spoke to Churchill with the dignity of equals, and to Stalin with a measured caution that masked his racing calculations. And beneath the surface of every word hovered a secret that only he now carried fully. The weapon being assembled halfway across the world. A weapon whose destructive power would alter every conversation in that room. For the first time, Truman felt a shift inside himself. The other leaders were not seeing a placeholder or an accident of circumstance. They were seeing the President of the United States behind him. The Roosevelt advisors observed with a mixture of pride, disbelief, and something like loss. They realized, perhaps more clearly than Truman himself, that their era had ended. The new president no longer needed their scaffolding. When Truman returned to Washington after the conference, the transformation was complete. The West Wing felt different now, quieter, leaner, stripped of the internal rivalries that had once pulsed beneath Roosevelt's complex network of confidants. Truman walked its halls with a steadier stride, past rooms where the old advisors had once spoken in the tones of men who believed they belonged by divine right. He passed empty offices, whose lights had been switched off for the last time. He passed open doors where new staff worked with crisp precision. He passed portraits of former presidents whose silent eyes seemed to measure him with a new respect. It was not triumph he felt, nor vindication. It was something far more somber. He had not fired Roosevelt's circle out of spite or insecurity. He had done it because a war-torn world could not afford a president stitched together from the remnants of another man's vision. The burden had to belong to him fully, even if it meant reshaping the government, one chair at a time. Night settled over Washington as Truman stood by the tall windows of the Oval Office, staring at the faint glow of the city. The Potomac shimmered like a dark ribbon under the moon. Somewhere beyond that horizon, countless soldiers waited for decisions. He had not yet made decisions he alone must bear. The war was not over. The hardest choice was still coming, and the men who once guided Roosevelt would not be the ones to guide him. Truman pressed his palm to the cool glass. For the first time, he felt not overshadowed by Roosevelt, but separated from him, divided by the unforgiving clarity of choice. He was no longer the man who inherited the presidency. He was becoming the man who defined it. By the end of July 1945, the shadows in Washington had changed shape. What had once been Roosevelt's government, layered with familiar voices, long-standing rivalries, and the peculiar choreography of men who had learned to orbit a towering personality, had transformed into something leaner, sharper, unmistakably Truman's. Yet for all the administrative battles he had won, the greatest test of his leadership waited beyond any hallway, beyond any committee, beyond any careful reshuffling of power. It waited over the Pacific, carried on the wings of a weapon that had not yet been used in human history. The decision Truman now faced was one no president before him had ever confronted: whether to unleash a force capable of annihilating an entire city in a single pulse of light. And despite all the advisors he had replaced, despite all the authority he had reclaimed from Roosevelt's old guard, Truman found himself again in a place only a president could occupy, alone at the center of an impossible choice. In those days, before the weapon had a name etched into the public's memory, the documents used colder language, special ordnance device, material of great explosive potential. Yet none of those words captured the truth, what the physicists whispered about, what the generals only hinted at. This was power that bent the boundaries of nature, a force that fused mathematics and fire into something that could unravel the fabric of a city in less than a heartbeat. One night, long after the lamps in the West Wing had been dimmed, Truman sat at the resolute desk reading the scientific briefing again. The paper glowed beneath the desk lamp, its diagrams stark and strange, its explanations trembling with what felt like equal parts brilliance and dread. Outside, Washington lay still, the streets glistening faintly from a passing rain. The distant hum of the city seemed muted, as though the world itself understood the gravity of the decision resting on a single man's shoulders. He imagined Hiroshima not as a name on a map, but as a place filled with children, houses, rivers, temples, real lives, whose paths would be severed by an act he alone must authorize. He imagined American soldiers preparing for an invasion of the Japanese mainland, boys barely shaving, fathers who had missed too many birthdays, men whose fates also hung in the balance. The war demanded an ending, but the instrument of that ending felt like a door that, once opened, could never again be closed. In that suffocating quiet, Truman understood with terrible clarity why Roosevelt might have kept this secret so closely guarded. To know of such a weapon was to carry a wound that could never heal. He closed the file slowly, as though trying not to disturb the sleeping ghosts inside it. The next morning, he convened a meeting with the military high command men who had fought the war across oceans and continents, who had lost comrades by the tens of thousands, who viewed every hour of delay as another grave dug in another faraway field. They spoke of casualties, strategies, alternatives. They outlined Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, and the unimaginable cost, hundreds of thousands of American lives, perhaps more. Then came the scientists, some confident, some uncertain. A few believed the demonstration of the weapon at a remote location might be enough to compel surrender. Others doubted Japan would yield without an undeniable shock, something so devastating, so immediate, so overwhelming that even the most hardened militarists could no longer argue for continuing the war. Truman listened to them all, his expression unreadable, his fingers interlaced tightly enough that the knuckles whitened. But he was no longer the uncertain man who had first stepped into Roosevelt's shadow. He had replaced the advisors who doubted him. He had asserted authority over the machinery of war. And yet, for all the power he now held, Truman understood that this decision transcended politics, transcended ego, transcended even his own presidency. This decision would stain the future. He dismissed the room to think alone. A soft wind drifted through the open window of the Oval Office as he stood gazing. Across the south lawn the trees swayed slowly, their leaves whispering like distant voices. The air smelled of cut grass, warm sunlight, and the faint metallic temps of summer storms. It was a peaceful scene, so peaceful that the contrast between this quiet lawn and the inferno he might soon unleash felt almost unbearable. And then, almost imperceptibly, he felt the memory of Roosevelt's presence recede, not vanish, not fade out of history, but loosen its grip on the moment. FDR had built the weapon, FDR had shaped the war, but the decision of how to end it, how to wield that terrible creation, did not belong to Roosevelt's era, it belonged to his. The final catalyst came from a letter, written by Truman's own mother, one of the few people whose words sliced through the armor of his newfound authority. She wrote simply, without flourish, in handwriting uneven from age. She hoped he was safe. She hoped the soldiers would come home soon. She hoped the war would end before it swallowed the last pieces of the world. She recognized Truman read that letter 3 times, each reading sinking deeper, each line reminding him that the war was not an abstraction measured in maps and projections. It touched every kitchen table, every telegram delivering boy, every cradle left empty by a father still fighting on distant shores. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in his pocket, and walked to the meeting that would mark the point of no return. His order was precise. His voice did not waver. His reasoning was written plainly in the historical record: to end the war quickly, to save lives on both sides, and to prevent the world from bleeding itself dry in a final, catastrophic invasion. But private reasoning, the part that lived only in Truman's conscience, was more complicated. He knew he was not merely ending a war, he was beginning the nuclear age. In the days that followed, as the first bomb fell over Hiroshima, Truman felt the weight of that irreversible act settle across his shoulders like a cloak woven from both fire and mourning. The reports arrived quickly, flashes of light, waves of heat, destruction unlike anything previously witnessed. Yet with them came something equally powerful. The first tremors of surrender. Japan's resistance faltered. The war reached its final days, and Truman, watching from across the ocean, understood that history had pivoted on his choice. When the surrender was announced, the streets of America erupted in a roar of relief, shouting, tears, celebrations that spilled onto every corner. Truman stepped onto the balcony of the White House, to the sound of a nation exhaling after years of dread. The war was over. The soldiers would come home. The world, wounded but alive, could begin to rebuild. But victory did not bring Truman ease. That night, when the celebrations had quieted and the city had returned to stillness, he sat again at the resolute desk. The war had ended. His authority was unquestioned. The Roosevelt circle was gone, replaced by a team that answered to him alone. Yet Truman felt none of the triumph that might have tempted another man. Instead, he felt the vast, aching solitude of a president who had carried a decision to be heavy for history to celebrate. He thought of his firing of Roosevelt's closest confidants not with regret, but with the sober knowledge that the road he had chosen required him to stand apart, to claim a burden no one else could share. Leadership, he now understood, was not simply the ability to make choices, but the willingness to be haunted by them. In the months that followed, as the post-war world began its long, uncertain birth, Truman's legacy slowly took shape. He oversaw demobilization, reconstruction, alliances, and the first uneasy steps into a geopolitical landscape shaped by the weapon he had authorized. But beneath every accomplishment, beneath every policy, beneath every speech, lay the silent truth that defined his presidency. He had stepped out of Roosevelt's shadow not to wield power, but to bear responsibility. His decision to remove Roosevelt's advisors had not been an act of revenge or pride. It had been the quiet rebellion of a man who refused to be ruled by history, a man who understood that the presidency could not be inherited, had to be forged. And on the night he finally signed the National Security Act, restructuring America's defense for the era he had ushered in, Truman paused for a long moment, staring at the signature he had just written. He thought of Roosevelt not with rivalry, not with resentment, but with the strange, solemn respect of one craftsman, looking upon the unfinished work of another. The age had changed, the tools had changed, and Truman, once obscured by another man's greatness, had become the architect of a world forever altered by choices only he could make. He closed the folder gently, turned off the lamp, and left the Oval Office in darkness. For the first time, the shadows on the wall belonged to him alone.